Welcome back, everyone. So for this session, which is for June 11th, we're going to talk only about cubism. And I have to say right up front that the readings and this material are pretty far and away the hardest of all the readings in the semester. So please don't be discouraged. It comes early on. I mean, cubism is a movement that unfolds over the first latter half of the first decade into the second decade of the 20th century. So it does come early, but please don't be discouraged. I'm hoping that the two lectures, which I'll try to keep a little bit more brief, will help you with the readings, either if you read before and then watch the lecture, or if you watch the lecture and then read. Hopefully I'm able to put it in a more bite-sized, more everyday kind of speech. So one of the reasons cubism is so difficult is because it's been studied to death, and there's so many different competing interpretations. It's a whole landscape of different contending readings of these paintings, what they meant, what they really are, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot there, and some art historians have gone very theoretical with their interpretation. So I hope to make it, a little bit more user-friendly, a little bit more speakerly, all while trying to explain these difficult theories to you. So let's see how it goes. So we're going to start with analytic cubism because it comes first. You have two phases of cubism. Analytic is first, and then synthetic comes second. And we're not really going to so much talk about why one is called analytic, why one is called synthetic. The book goes over that more or less. Just briefly, these paintings in analytic cubism, they look like the painters are analyzing the world to death. They're giving you lots of information in almost this fragmented form. So that's where the term analysis analytic came from when it came. Hi, Jackson. That's my cat. He's going to interrupt us every once in a while. So that's where the term analytic comes from. You'll see synthetic has to do with introducing foreign materials that are not deemed to be, or before then were not deemed to be art materials in art. So that's more or less the terms. But let's leave the terms aside and let's just go straight to some of the ideas and the history, because I find that to be more interesting and more important. So with analytic cubism, I like to start with a few technologies and forms of media that were starting to emerge in the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th century, that influenced a lot of artists. This won't just be for cubism, but it has a profound effect on the way artists, and not just artists, everybody, saw the world, understood conceptions of time and of space. And one of these would be chronophotography. So photography is invented in 1827, and of course it's a revolutionary moment in representation. But someone like Etienne Jules Marais and another photographer named Muybridge, who you might know, started working with chronophotography, which you might know more as like stop motion photography or something like this, right? This is a beautiful example of Marais' chronophotography, chrono meaning time, chronophotography of this pelican that's sort of making its way down, maybe onto the water. And so you're seeing it in successive frames. And to our eyes, maybe this doesn't seem so radical, so revolutionary, but just imagine that this is before the invention of film. This is before anyone had ever seen a moving image. And so it's as if you're seeing all on one negative. Let's say, how many pelicans are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You're seeing 6 different separate moments in time all at once, right? So this is radical. And even more so, you're able to see the world through photography, through this fragmentation of time. This is the beginnings of in sports, if anybody watches sports. This is the very beginnings of like slow motion, right? So you're able to see the world in a way that with the normal human vision, you'd never be able to see. No one could see a pelican flying like this in such a methodical, frame by frame sort of way. For us, it would more or less be a blur. And so this is a radical new way of seeing the world that is going to influence not only perhaps the cubists, but definitely the futurists and some other artists that we discussed this semester. So notice that with Marais here, time, space is starting to fragment. It's starting to expand, and we're starting to have a new vision of time and space through this new medium. But of course, there's nothing like film to express this newfound understanding of time and the image and space as something manipulable and fragmented, that you can then see in some ways all at once. Or in the case of film, sometimes what you're dealing with is moments that are fragmented, but they look as if they're seamless within the image. So a great example is a very, very early film by Georges Millet, The Astronomer's Dream from 1898. The Lumiere brothers invent film just 1 or 2 years before, 1896, 1897. One of the first films shown was just a very short clip of a locomotive coming forward towards the camera. And the audience had never seen a film before, so half the audience freaked out and ran out because they thought they were going to get hit by a locomotive. So this tells you how new this visual language was for people. It's old hat for us, right? People are on TikTok. I've never actually seen TikTok, but these little moving image frames of the stupid little things of everyday life, or they might not be stupid. This is like second nature. It's all over the place. But in the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th century, this is a radical new language of being able to represent the world in time and through cuts. So let me show you this. It's a very brief film. It would have been silent. It's called The Astronomer's Dream. It would have been silent at the time, but someone, as is often the case with silent film, there's a score added on top. So it's short, so I'll show it to you. So it's the astronomer's dream. The scientist who all of a sudden it's really more of a nightmare for him. The world isn't this trusty thing that he can measure anymore. It's constantly changing. It's not dependable. And of course, the Millet's conveys this conveys this through cuts, right? So the illusion of chairs and desks and whatever else suddenly disappearing is simply a cut in time. And so with film, you have two different temporalities in some ways. So you have the illusory temporality, the time of the film itself, which for us was like, 3 minutes? So, and which seems seamless, like the flow of life that we're experiencing right now as human beings. But then the time of the film itself is highly fragmented, right? These are all separate moments in time filled and then stitched together to seem as if they're seamless through these cuts. So this is quite a radical conception or reconception of representation, of space and of time, and of the image. And we know that Picasso and a lot of his friends, fellow artists and poets and writers at the time, they were definitely seeing these early films. And they must have been in some ways an influence on painting in the early half of the 20th century, as was chronophotography, right? Which, there are things that we have in common here. And we also know that a friend of Picasso's was interested in the fourth dimension, which, I don't know, not to get too interstellar here, if anybody's seen Interstellar, but theories of the fourth dimension, which were pretty current at this time, had to do with, in the same way that we experience the world in 3 dimensions. So we see, and we can touch things in three dimensions. There's the idea that maybe there's a fourth dimension where not only do you see things, in 3 dimensions, but you can see them in multiple points in time. So the fourth dimension would be the ability to see the world at the same time from different times. Right. So there was a folding visiting card that one of the artists, one of the friends of Picasso, they go to cafes together. I forget his name now. But he liked William James, a pragmatist philosopher, an American philosopher, American pragmatist, who had this folding visit card experiment. And it's one of these illusions where you get the sense, depending on how you're looking at it, that the card is either coming out at you or receding in the back. Although, of course, it's a static image. It's not changing. And so there's a way in which here, not even through photography or through a moving image like film, you get the sense that at the same time you're seeing an image in 2 different ways. And it might even be moving in your eye, depending on how you look at it. And so Picasso, it's said that he was interested in these theories of the fourth dimension, and he may have included it. Remember, in our last session, I said that a lot of people have made quite a bit out of the chest of this demoiselle, and people have read that her chest is in fact something of reproduction of this folding visiting card from William James. And so here you would have a proto-cubist gesture along the lines of some of the first ways in which cubism was read. Namely, that cubism was a way in which to see the world through multiple perspectives, which means almost inherently multiple positions, multiple moments in time. So you see, this is why I introduced this session with chronophotography, with film, and with the optical illusion from William James, because they all share this thing in common, that you're seeing an image that is somehow conveying to you multiple moments in time, and also multiple perspectives, right? So the earliest interpretations of cubism, so by Guillaume Apollinaire, very famous French poet, a friend of Picasso, but not just him, some other lesser-known cubists who were working in the guise of Picasso and Braque, the Puteaux-cubists, they also shared this interpretation. They basically said that human vision is impoverished, like we can see the world in 3 dimensions, but it's always from a single vantage point. We can never overcome this. We can never, let's say, are you sitting on a chair or you have a computer in front of you like I do right now, you can only ever see it from one perspective. Of course, you can shift, you can move to one side or the other, and then you get it from another perspective, but you've changed in time, so you can't get it simultaneously. So the earliest interpretations of cubism were that these cubist paintings that Braque and Picasso were doing in 1910, 1911 were basically giving you the world from multiple perspectives all at once. So you're getting more perspectives. So what visually are we talking about here? These are analytic cubist works. I show you two from the chapter, but there are so many of them. The Met actually has a really nice collection of early cubist work. So once that opens up, hopefully that'll open up someday soon and it'll all be safe to go. You'll be able to see more of these. But this is Picasso, a portrait of a very famous collector and friend of Picasso and Braque, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, from 1910. And so you see how you have more or less a traditional subject matter, a portrait, right? It's a guy sitting there with his, looks like his hands are folded. He's kind of smiling at you. But whoa, is it rendered in a way that's completely different from anything you're used to when it comes to portraiture, even from someone like Matisse, where you still had a figure in one moment in time, however much abstracted, you still had the figure from one vantage point, and it was more or less clear what the contours of the body were. Here, with this sitter, Picasso is giving you this almost fragmented conception. Well, no, not almost fragmented. It feels completely like an explosion of fragments of the sitter. You get a bit of the face, you get a bit of the hands, but the body and the environment is probably sitting in an apartment or maybe in a cafe. They love to go to cafes. It's all fragmented in all these little cubes, all these little geometric shapes, which is where the term right around this time came from. A critic, Louis Vauxhall, said, "Oh, these are all like little cubes." So cubism stuck. And here you have another one, Braque. I don't want to oversell Picasso here. Picasso is such a huge name looming over early 20th century art. It's not the last time we're going to talk about him, but Braque is equally important for this adventure they undertake together in this new pictorial language of Cubism at the time, in 1910, 1911, early 1912. In some ways, Braque is even more important. Sometimes Braque gets to certain insights even more quickly than Picasso. So Braque is really important here. It's also important to remember that they worked almost in tandem, and sometimes they wouldn't even sign their paintings. It's as if they were sort of exploring this new form of painting together. And so the earliest interpretations of these works was that you're getting Kahnweiler, this person, not just from one vantage point, but from multiple perspectives. It's the same thing with the Portuguese. Portuguese is a guitar player in a bar here. So you're not just seeing, like Picasso's man playing guitar from his blue period, you're not just seeing it from one perspective, you're seeing it from multiple perspectives. And so this was the way in which Cubism was understood. And I think it's still like, if anybody talks about Cubism today and like common knowledge, usually it's just thought, oh yeah, they showed you all these multiple perspectives at once. That's what Cubism was about. And there are some scholars that agree with this very early assessment of Cubism, that in fact you are getting multiple perspectives. And some even say that, some even note that during this time, 1905 is an important date for the history of science. This is when Einstein publishes his first paper on relativity. These are also the decades in which quantum mechanics are starting to be developed by physicists, someone like Max Planck, around 1910. And so I'm not going to go in class. I usually make a kind of a long analogy here, but I don't want to go down a rabbit hole. I just want to give you the basics. I'm fascinated by physics. In another life, I would have maybe done a PhD in physics or something like that instead of philosophy and art history. But it's good to be interested in lots of things, even if you remain an amateur like me when it comes to science. But around this time, you do have the theory of relativity that comes along, in which Einstein is basically saying existence, the universe, there is no single perspective. And in fact, the perspective you have on the world, even space and time, which both curve and are malleable in Einsteinian physics, is relative. It depends on your position in space and time. So the conception of, again, space and time is really starting to change here. And that's at the scale of the very, very large. In quantum physics, this is the scale of the very, very small. where you have elementary particles, this is the subatomic, that behave in ways that are really different from our everyday experience of reality and of matter. Matter is by and large empty space for the quantum physics, and things like an electron behave in ways that are quite different than, let's say, a stone that we just throw on the floor, and it's dependable that gravity will take over and it will accelerate towards the floor at a constant, eventually at a constant rate. So we're starting to get a radical reconception of reality of the very, very big and the very, very small, at the same moment that painters are starting to completely reorient their understanding of painting. And so some have argued that Picasso basically, although he would never have read Einstein, would never have really known these theories, it would somehow, through painting, he intuited the theory of the relativity through these multiple relative perspectives within the canvas of these analytic paintings. So that might be interesting, but most art historians take issue with these interpretations. So both the early interpretation of these Cubist works as showing you multiple perspectives, and also the idea that somehow Picasso intuited scientific breakthroughs of the early 20th century through these paintings. Art historians have a somewhat more limited, and it makes sense, a more art-specific way of interpreting these paintings. It has much more to do with painting as a language itself for art historians. And the merit of these theories is that, well, it does seem to align a bit more with what Picasso and Braque said themselves about what they were doing. And so for art historians, it's not about multiple perspectives all at once. It's not about the theory of relativity. It's much more about reconciling the two features of painting that are inherent to painting, that no other painters had ever tried to reconcile before in the history of art. And so that's the fact that a painting inherently is an illusory space, a space of representation. So think of the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is a flat surface, but you don't see the flatness at all. You see the Mona Lisa and you see the landscape in the background, and you really actually forget about the flatness of the canvas. And going back to the history of all the way back to the Renaissance, this is what single point perspective painting has always been like. It's a flat plane that you forget about, and you have this illusory window onto another world. And so you have an illusory space. So what Picasso were doing is they were dissatisfied with his history. They wanted to show the material, the very real, literal flatness of what they were working on. So this is why the figures and the subjects in their paintings, it's as if they've been steamrolled and flattened, and the bodies and all the still lives and everything else that are in the paintings, they've like exploded into little shingles that have been that are totally flattened, so that you create almost like a grid-like flat surface in the painting. And so what happens there, you get a sense of, oh wow, okay, this is paint. This is a grid-like flat surface. So they're calling attention to the material of the canvas and of the paint, which inherently is flat, right? But this is the crucial part here. Picasso and Braque did not want to go to abstract painting, like we're going to see actually pretty soon. They wanted to retain some of the illusion of painting, which is inherent to painting, right? They thought painting had to be in some ways mimetic. It had to be, it had to have some depth. And so what they're doing here, they're trying to almost do like a happy middle. So you get the flatness through this cubist fragmentation of the subject, but it's a very shallow one, right? So you have all these different shadings and planes that are tilting up and down, left and right. Think of almost like a topographical map. Those maps that actually have ridges. think of this almost like a shallow landscape, but not with a unified light source, and not too far in. So they're simultaneously showing you a little bit of depth and the flatness of the canvas. And so that's the way in which most art historians have interpreted these. Not the scientific interpretation, not the multiple perspectives thing, but the fact that Picasso and Braque were trying to do something that's almost impossible, and no one had done before. Analyzing painting not only for its illusory capabilities, its ability to represent the natural world, but also to call attention to its material support, to the very real canvas and paint and lines and so on and so forth, right? So it's almost like there's a fancy word for this, dialectic, where you have two terms that are almost in constant tension with each other. And in this case, in cubism, they don't really resolve. They're in constant tension. You're constantly seeing these as flat, but also seeing a little bit of depth, as if there is a shallow recession into space with some of these tilted planes and fragmented features. And so we'll end this first half by talking about the transition painting, one of the key works that move us towards the synthetic cubism, which will be the second half of the second half of the class, and that's Picasso's still life with chair caning. And so what you have with still life and chair caning, it's an oval canvas, and it's still using some of the earlier fragmentation of the cubist style, but he's also added foreign objects that are not really considered to be art objects. So one is a rope. Notice the rope is basically like providing the frame, and another is an oilcloth reproduction of chair caning. So think of like, outdoor furniture or something like that. You have this like chair caning that would support you as you're sitting on the chair. So that's what this is, right? And then all of this is painting a still life with the journal, the newspaper in French, but you're only getting the jour. They like to do these puns in these works, and then these fragmented cubist still life. So maybe like a candle or a bottle of wine or a glass and whatever. And so you have painting, but you also have these newly non-art materials that before would never have been deemed to be art. Art had only been sculpture made of marble or bronze, and painting had always been painting. So this is pretty radical work within the history of Western European modernism. So that will lead us to synthetic, but this work too is undergoing a tension or a dialectic in the way I just explained to you, but not so much a tension between literal flatness and the illusion of depth, but Picasso here is interested in another almost impossible reconciliation of terms, and that's between seeing, and think about it, the whole history of painting from the Renaissance, from 1907 or whatever, before Demoiselles, all the way back to the Renaissance, painting had been purely visual, right? For the most part, it's purely visual. You're simply using your vision. And so Picasso starts to do some interesting things here, because he wants to. It's as if he thinks that that's an impoverished understanding of painting. That painting could actually supply feeling to other senses of the body, because we smell, we touch, we feel, we see. Like we're multi-sensory creatures when we're looking at a painting or whatever it might be, when we're looking at the world. So in this transitional work towards synthetic cubism, Picasso maybe was trying to reconcile two other things. That is the purely visual, but also the fact that when we're in the world, it's not just our vision that we're using. We're also touching things. We're also feeling the world. And we also kind of feel, if you're at the edge of a cliff or something like that, you sort of feel this vertiginous thing, like you feel your body. You feel the world sort of receding away from you. So he's trying to do these two things. And how does he do it? In some ways, it's quite simple. he gives you a painting that's a still life, which, is, in this case, it's fragmented, but it's somewhat traditional. You're seeing it, even if it's flattened and has a little bit of depth, like the earlier paintings. But he also gives you the sense that you're looking down, that maybe you're even in some way seated, right? Because this starts to look like a table. This starts to look like maybe the top of the table or a chair. And so at the same time, you're seeing the still life, but you're also maybe looking down and seated at the still life, as if you're at this cafe, which, of course, as I said before, Picasso and all these bohemians in Paris, the cafe was the place to be, to discuss and to talk and to drink and to experiment with things. So it's as if here the reconciliation is between the visual and the haptic, between seeing and touching or feeling. And I'm not going to go into this too much because I'll just go over time for the first half. But he's definitely influenced by Cézanne. So Cézanne already did this in certain ways in his wonderful paintings of the latter part of the 19th century. So in this Basket of Apples, you're getting a still life as you're seeing it, but you're also in some ways sort of feeling it, as if you're in the space, as if like the table, through the peripheral vision that we all have all around our eyes, in this case the lower part, it's as if the table is sort of coming down and drooping a little bit, as if we're kind of sitting just above it, right? So in this Basket of Apples, Cézanne, some theories say that he's giving you a phenomenological approach to painting, that you're not only seeing it, your whole body is kind of sensing the painting as we do in the real world. So maybe both Cézanne and Picasso are trying to do the impossible, which is through painting mimic not only how we see the world, but how we feel it, how we touch it, how we smell it, and everything else, right? That is the whole sensorium of being the type of beings that we are. So I hope that makes sense of the chapter a little bit more. I hope I put it in more everyday terms for you. And then after our break, we'll go to the even more tricky and more challenging part of cubism, which is synthetic cubism, which again, I hope I will make sense of it for you. So talk to you in a bit.